Hello everyone, it's Mark here from HarwellXPS, and today I've got something a little bit different. Moving forward, we're going to be sharing more of our research outputs through YouTube, as well as training and data analysis support videos that we've already produced so far, and we will continue to do so. But to kick us off, I'm going to be talking about a paper I published earlier this year in Advanced Functional Materials, looking at the production of 2,5-bis 2-furalmethylidene cyclopentanone from cyclopentanone and furfural, an important step in the production of aviation fuels from biomass sources. So I've worked with porous materials for many years. Since my PhD under Professors Adam Lee and Karen Wilson, I've worked with them in catalysis, carbon capture, environmental remediation and biomedical applications. They are a really interesting and versatile class of materials because structurally they are amazing porous silicas. You can make all kinds of shapes and sizes, symmetries and combinations, but chemically they are pretty boring. To get them to do anything, you really generally need to add some kind of chemical functionality, whether this is nanoparticles, surface coatings, tethered organic groups. Just something needs to be added to get them to do things. So that's what we've looked to do in this work, anchoring monolayer and sub-monolayer titanium coverages across a high surface area silica, known as SVA15, in order to make them more chemically interesting. And this is achieved using metal alkoxides in anhydrous conditions to prevent self-condensation and polymerization. And this uses the surface silanols as a nucleophile to add the titanium centers to the silica surface, liberating alcohol. What I wanted to do was look at how these monolayers deposit and condense, determine what kind of different chemistries we can achieve with our eventual high surface area titanosilicates. The titanium alkoxides were added to the silica support in stoichiometric amounts relative to the amount of silanols on the surface in order to produce fractional surface coverages from 0.2 to 1 of a completed monolayer. And then our challenge was to investigate the structures formed, identify what chemistries were being produced on these surfaces, and correlate these with the catalytic assaying of these materials for the double aldol condensation of furfural and cyclopentanone. So the reaction that we wanted to look at was a key step in the production of sustainable aviation fuels. Taking cyclopentanone and furfural, the first step is an aldol condensation, combining the CPON and FAL to give the beta hydroxyketone and subsequent dehydration to the enone product, which can then undergo a second aldol condensation to our final product at the bottom of the screen here. Now typically this reaction is solid acid catalyzed, but our reaction testing determined a significant photoactivated promotion, which we attribute to the activation of Lewis adduct formations during this acid activation step. Our materials routinely outperformed the benchmark materials, but one in particular stood out. When we normalized for titanium mass, most of the materials reported equal activity apart from one. Now, our lowest loading material reported a 25% increase in initial rate compared to the rest, and this was reflected in both the visible and the UV light exposed reactions. But why? So let's go back to the start. We need to understand our materials to discern why we observe this discrepancy. And we should probably start with the silica framework substrate, just to make sure that our material is exactly what we think it is. Small angle X-ray scattering and nitrogen absorption porosymmetry confirmed our base structure was as expected. So then we can move on to our titanium modified materials. So quantification is probably where we should start, right? Because we need to know exactly how much of our active sites we have. EDX analysis reported pretty consistent contents, aligning with our expectations, while XPS aligned well with a general increase in the XPS to EDX ratio, as we might expect, given that this titanium is located on the outer surface by design. It's important to note, in order to ensure our quantification is accurate, we have corrected for the attenuation due to carbon overlayers. Since different peaks have different kinetic energies, they will be attenuated by carbon overlay layers to different extents, and which will influence our quantifications. But there is a method that we can use to compensate for this. I'm not going to go into detail here because I think we'll probably do a full video on this in the future. It's a very useful method. So for now, let's just be satisfied that we did this correction method and our quantification will not be influenced by this carbon overlay. Okay, so we know roughly what we expect so far, but we still don't know much about the chemistry. X-ray diffraction was no help, which should be no surprise. The idea is that these films are very thin, so we're not really going to have a large enough crystalline domain to produce enough constructive and destructive interference to give us a diffraction pattern. The Raman was more useful, so 4 of the 5 materials suggested an anatase-like structure, but we still actually have no information on our best catalyst. So fortunately at Harwell, we have access to NEXAFS on the B07 beamline Versox. You can access this through the HarwellXPS website via rapid access. NEXAFS finally gives us an indication that we do have some different chemistry going on. Our low loading catalyst actually reported a rutile-like structure, unlike our other materials. So great, we've finally seen some kind of difference. But hang on, if we look at our reaction profiles, rutile and anatase don't really seem to perform very differently. So perhaps this isn't the only thing that's going on that's affecting our initial rates. So now we're getting into the real XPS analysis, and straight away we find that our TI2P peaks broaden, which could of course be due to a number of things, different vibrational broadening, etc., but it's probably more likely to be multiple different chemical or electronic states that give us this expanded binding energy range. We also looked at the Auger parameter for the titanium centers and found that this changed proportionally with surface coverage. And if we actually deconvolute the Auger parameter energies into the initial and final state contributions, we see a similar trend for the final state energy contributions, while the initial state energy contributions actually decrease as we get to higher coverages. If you're a bit confused as to what I'm talking about here, we do actually have an in-depth explainer video on Auger energies and initial and final states and all the kind of maths that goes on in there. I will stick a link in the description below, but effectively this tells us a bit of information about our surface acidity of our tiny titanium sites, and that these are decreasing with coverage. The ammonia TPD analysis that we did to support this this observation did trend in the same way. We see that our low loading catalyst did report a slightly higher acid site strength for this material, so this is a potential source for our increased activity. But when we look at the chemistry by the XPS, it doesn't really show an outlier, it shows a general trend, so perhaps there is more going on than just this. These observations by the Auger parameter as well were further supported by linear combination fitting of the oxygen KLL in order to segregate the titanium oxygen and silicon oxygen contributions to this. When we looked at the P carrier ratio of the KL23L23 to KL1L23 Augers and the energy separation between them, both of these indicated a more ionic character for the oxygen as we approached higher coverages, which again is consistent with a decreased acidity. But this isn't just an acid catalyzed reaction. We saw in our first catalytic slide that it is promoted by photoactivation, so we should probably actually check the electronic structure as well. Unfortunately, in surface science, we have ways to do this. As well as the traditional method of drugs, we also have reflectance electron energy loss spectroscopy reels, which we can use to probe the band gaps. We can also use UPS to analyze the valence band maximum and work functions. So we do see a small increase in the band gap, which we ascribe to quantum confinement effects, when we go to smaller and smaller coverages. We also see a decrease in the valence band maximum and the work function, which suggests that core hole formation is getting slightly more favorable during the photoactivation of the more complete monolayer structure, so as we get to higher surface coverages. But again, all of this suggests slightly improved performances with increased coverages and in a bit of a trend. And so this is kind of at odds with our catalytic observations, and realistically is unlikely to actually explain our results. So the final thing that we wanted to look at was the spatial location of our deposited films, and they should all be on the surface, and there are ways that we can use XPS to probe this, and as well as XPS, complementary techniques such as ion scattering spectroscopy. Now, ion scattering spectroscopy indicated that the surface coverage increased in a approximately linear trend, as we would kind of expect for this synthesis. So our reaction is self-limiting in nature, and they should be incapable of forming larger island type structures, provided that our synthesis is kept completely anhydrous and free from moisture. But another way that we can investigate spatial locale is by looking at two photo emission peaks with different kinetic energies. Our Ti2p region has a reasonably high kinetic energy of around 1 kiloelectron volt. If we take our titanium LMM Auger emission by comparison, this has got a kinetic energy of around 400 electron volts, which means the inelastic mean free path, and hence the information depth of these two emissions, is going to be different. And our titanium LMM Auger is going to be giving us a signal from closer to the surface. Now, if we think about the pore structure of our material here, we're going to have contributions from titanium atoms that are located on the outer surface of our material, but also buried within our material, coating the walls of those pores within the material. Now, the titanium 2p photoelectrons will have enough kinetic energy to give us a signal from the walls of these pores, whereas our Auger electrons are unlikely to be able to escape to the outer surface and be detected in our experiment before they're attenuated. When we look at the area ratio of these two peaks at low fractional coverages, this ratio pretty closely matches a reference of pure TiO2, but as we increase the coverage, the amount of titanium 2p relative to the Auger increases, and this is attributed to a difference in how much of our surface is coated by titania versus how much of our inner pores are coated by titania, because in our low coverage example, if we have the majority of our titania on the outer surface only, we will get a very similar ratio to a pure titanium reference, because there should be no difference in how much of the signal is coming from the surface versus the pores. When we start to add enough titanium that we're coating the pore walls as well, we're then going to start to see an imbalance, because we are going to see Ti2p signal from the inner pores. We are not going to see the titanium LMM Auger signal from inside these pores. So this peak area ratio increases because we have a difference in how we are coating the external surface versus the pore walls during our synthesis. And it seems as if there is some kind of diffusion limitation in our synthesis, so that we preferentially coat the external surface before we start coating the mesopores. So if at low loadings we have a more externally located active site, which also presents slightly greater acidity, this combination can now begin to explain our observed differences. Our reaction involves relatively sterically bulky compounds and a particularly large product, and an external active site is going to be free from diffusion limitations when we do our actual catalysis, while when we start to fill our pores with an active site, we are potentially going to start introducing some kind of pore diffusion limited kinetics into our catalytic reaction. And so once we normalize to the overall titanium mass, this is going to have an impact on our normalized initial rate once we have this diffusion to contend with. So that's it. We used XPS and complementary analysis to great effect to solve a really challenging problem in our catalytic analysis. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking and acknowledging the people that helped with this work. Sasha and Junji were some fantastic undergraduate project students I had working on material synthesis. Dr. Chris Pilot and his group members, Cameron Price, who's now at Zero Petroleum, and Tony Torres Lopez, who's now at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, as well as Inez Lizcano Gonzalez and a PhD student, Ed Garland. Dr. Lee Durndal and Dr. Vania dos Santos at the University of Plymouth were the lead on the catalysis aspects of these projects. So they did with the reactions and applications testing. Finally, my HarwellXPS colleague Arthur for his help with the NEXAFS measurements, and my former postdoc Harry Drivas, who helped supervise Sasha and Junji. So that was our first research talk. Hopefully we can talk about more of the research coming out of the National Facility soon. But until then, thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye-bye.